I am live. I didn't read yesterday. I was too busy. Today is the 8th, 2023, the 8th of August. Happens to be the Lion Portal. I'm reading Out of Mind. It's an autobiography of Joan Marshall Grant. She lived from 1907 to 1989. It's a very old copy I have. That's why I'm protecting it. I'm coming to part 5 now. Joan Grant was a seeker and a writer of her previous memories, reincarnations, and we are now, I think in the 30s, late 30s, part 5. Chapter 1, Highlands. 1st September, Leslie went back to Iraq for his second season at Tel Asma, and Gillian and I moved into a Mews cottage for 6 months while Beaufort Street was let to an American film actor. It was a long, cold winter, and after Gillian had gone to bed, the evenings were lonely, as my budget was too narrow to allow much hospitality. I had already realized the limitations of psychometry, and so I decided to try to develop the faculty, which had been much more vivid when I was a child, of remembering previous personalities. I concentrated on a scene, such as the one with the French girl who was mentioned in part 1, episode 5, and then tried to extend it beyond the scope I had previously remembered. For instance, I knew she rode a black horse towards an archway at the end of an avenue of limes. What was beyond the arch? If a clear picture came into my mind, I concentrated on it, noticing details, the more trivial the better. It's a stable yard. How many doors? What is that thing in the corner? A pump? No, it's a hoist for lifting sacks into the loft. On the left of the yard, the second coach house had a hinge hanging loose. There's a clump of weeds beside the larger of the stone troughs. What kind are they? Dandelions? No, coltsfoot. I then tried to alter what I was seeing. If it was subjective, I could change the number of the doors, mend the hinge, turn the yellow patch of coltsfoot into a rosebush, or remove it altogether. I could then dismiss the sequence as imagination. But if it was objective, I could not alter it by an effort of will, for it was no more susceptible to change than any three-dimensional stable yard would have been. If the emotional content of the scene was small, I could see everything as a dispassionate observer. But as the emotions of the other personality came more closely engaged, the visual impressions became relatively subordinate, and the other senses, feeling, hearing, and, oddly enough, smell, became more dominant. I might see the girl several times in the stable yard, but each occasion would appear different to me, according to the mood in which she was seeing it. If she was worried about lack of money on a particular morning, the broken hinge, the weeds, would be the chief things that she, and therefore I, would notice. If she was ebullient, the cooing of the pigeons on the roof, the smell of straw and horse and leather, her own feelings of physical well-being as she got into the saddle, would occupy her attention. This is only a very brief outline of what in fact was an arduous process, which I pursued because my mind, trained by father to expect scientific proof, demanded evidence which would make it accept more easily my intuition. The results were encouraging but inconclusive. By holding myself between sleeping and waking, sufficiently dissociated to focus 9/10 of my attention on what I was contacting on a more subtle level, but keeping the remaining 10th alert to scribble detailed notes every few minutes, which was more difficult than dictating a running commentary. I had experiences beyond the normal range. But was the French girl a memory of myself in a previous existence, or could I as a child have tuned into her by psychometry without realizing what I was doing? There were 4 pieces of French furniture at Seacourt, which I valued because they had been left to me by Jenny. I could remember tracing the outline of the marqueterie leaves with my fingers because I enjoyed the smoothness of the polished wood. They had been given to Jenny by the ex-Empress Eugenie and had come from the Tuileries. But they belonged to the 18th, not the 19th century, so they could have been in the chateau with the green shutters. This theory became untenable, because though I had recalled quite a lot about a Greek and a Red Indian, there had not been even a shred of Greek pottery. nor anything remotely connected with Red Indians in the house. By the time I was 12, repeated rebuffs had taught me that to claim the memory of previous lives was the quickest way to lose friends and fail to influence people. So now I must keep what I was trying to do secret, even from Daisy and Leslie, unless, and it seemed a very remote possibility, I could train myself to recall at will not only a few dramatic incidents but a complete life. Having nothing much else to do, I worked too hard and gave myself acute headaches. I had rarely suffered from them before, and these were particularly tiresome as I knew they had no physical origin, although they felt as though the top of my skull was deeply bruised and becoming as thin as a baby's fontanelle. However, the pain responded to aspirin, if taken in quantity. But I lost over a stone in weight, and instead of sleeping well, was lucky if I got 2 or 3 hours at night. Leslie was due back in March, but stayed away an extra 6 weeks to go on a shooting expedition with Seton. I had been counting the days for his return, but consoled myself with the thought that he would find us comfortably reinstalled in Beaufort Street, and because of my uncongenial economies, reasonably solvent. In this I had been over-optimistic, as I learned when I met the man from Harrods who had been checking the inventory. "I'm afraid you will have a shock," "as I did, madam," he said, "when you see the condition in which your tenant has left the house. However, his representative has agreed £600 compensation. Little enough, I fear, when you see the damage to your antique furniture." But the film actor skipped back to Hollywood without paying a cent. I even had to find £280 for his transatlantic telephone calls before the telephone manager would reconnect me. This was glum news for Leslie's homecoming, especially as he had just heard that the dig was closing down, so he was out of a job. The only thing to do was to redecorate the house, let it again, and go to Mukarach, where for 10 months in the year we could live rent-free. Gillian would like living in the country, but Scotland was a long way from Hurtwood, and I was worried about Daisy's health, although she insisted that the operation she had undergone during the winter was only for the removal of non-malignant cyst. I had expected Leslie to be bored, because his friends and clubs and tennis, without his friends and clubs and tennis, but Nina Seafield and her husband Derek Stutley Herbert were at Castle Grant, and we saw a lot of them. When they moved back to her other home, Cullen House, we often went over to stay. I was lucky enough to find a close friend in our nearest neighbour, Gwen Graham, a widow, who in many ways reminded me of Daisy. She had built a charming modern house on the edge of the moor above Mukarach, which commanded a magnificent view of the Cairngorms. She was now making a garden, which encouraged me to do the same. I always have an urge to put down roots, actual as well as figuratively, even when experience warns that it always hurts to pull them up again. Leslie, who had never shown any interest in gardening before, helped me enthusiastically. We turfed the horrid little flower beds, which looked as though they had been made by a pastry cutter. With stones from some of the pigsties, we made dry walls to terrace the slope for 2 long herbaceous borders. Nina, who had already told the Seafield estate office to have the house redecorated, gave me quantity of plants, including about 50 clumps of blue poppies, which, difficult as they were to grow in the south, even at Hurtwood, rioted among the rhubarb at Castle Grant. I planted the narrow border which surrounded the house with sweet peas that covered the dour stone wall to the eaves. We built a dam 10 feet high and 30 feet long across a burn in the birchwood, making a sombre pool that fed a series of decorative waterfalls between mossy banks, which in the autumn would be planted with bulbs and polyanthus. The day after the dam was finished, for which we had to call in professional help, as it persisted in leaking, I was sitting there, feeling extraordinarily contented, when I heard a small sound and looked up to see a pair of roe deer with a fawn standing beside me. I had never seen roe deer on our side of the Spey, but they had adopted us and stayed near the house for the rest of the summer. Gillian wanted a pet goat, so I found a 3-day-old kid for her, which she brought up on a bottle and named Rosemary. She was as easy to house-train as a dog, slept on a pink blanket beside her mistress' bed, and would have slept on it if Gin, her bull terrier, had not growled from her place under the eiderdown. Rosemary was a wild Highland goat, black except for a fawn flash on each side of her face, and in due course she grew horns, which she butted me if I told her she was growing too large to sit comfortably on my lap. She butted visitors much harder and sometimes caused callers to retreat in haste down the drive, but she was so clearly under the protection of Pan that I never managed to be really cross with her, even when she nibbled all my best delphiniums. Janine and I went for exploring walks, in which we sometimes traced a burn to its source, a burn that might be the Amazon teeming with alligators or run through the hunting ground of a hostile tribe of Red Indians, which made it necessary for us to advance with caution on hand and knees. If we were being pioneers, the low ground of the moor became a trackless prairie, with the amiable shooting pony as our covered wagon. Crossing Himalayan ravines by means of a fallen pine tree over the Donlane River became less popular after we both fell in. She became an ardent gilly, and when I was fishing, used to crouch beside me on the bank, alert to take a trout off the hook and kill it for me. I seldom caught more than enough for her supper, but trout so small that they should have been thrown back were her favourite delicacy and known as Mummy's special sardines. She had plenty of companions of her own age, for as well as Fraser, the gardener's 2 sons, there were Crofter's children, for whom I turned the back kitchen into a playroom, where they could cook and eat the trout they caught instead of discarding them as they used to do. Their parents tended to believe that fish that did not come out of a tin was unfit for food and should be classed with vermin. This embargo extended to rabbits, hares, and even to homemade jam. So I provided fruit of which there was far more than we could eat, and the necessary sugar. There were 14 amateur cooks, of whom the oldest was 12, and they made over 100 pounds of preserves. Leslie's shotgun provided material for a large number of stews and pies. Rosemary and Gin disposed of the failures. When they heard that A.D. had let the house to shooting tenants, they thought we were being turned out and offered to reorganize a strike of beaters. The foreigners will be away back to England if they have to chase their own birds across the heather, said one of them hopefully. And another suggested that even if their parents made them go out on the hill, it would not be difficult to annoy the invaders by turning the birds away from the butts. So I hastily assured them that we should have to go south, even if the place had been left empty, and that we would all be back again before the end of September. That was chapter 1, and I'll do them chapter by chapter because we're coming to the end.